Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about the Venezuelan FN model of 1930 Mauser. These are probably the cleanest and most beautiful Mausers that you can get on the US market today. So now before we talk about the Venezuelan Mauser, we need to talk a little bit about the history behind this gun. So it's made by FN in Belgium. I'm always surprised how many people don't know that FN made Mausers. I think most people just have an association with FN and like the SCAR and the FN57, stuff like that. Like they think it's kind of just a modern company where, in fact, FN's roots are all the way back to the Mauser 1889 rifle. And then the next big thing for FN was the the FN 1899 and the 1900 pistol here. They were pretty much on the cutting edge for most of their history. Now we're going to kind of fast forward through World War I. At the end of World War I, Belgium, of course, was occupied by the Germans. The FN factory is freed from German occupation, and they're free to make Mausers again. More importantly, FN lost their German ownership and the German control of their company. So now FN is free to pretty much make Mausers of whatever type they want and sell to whoever they want. Before, they kind of had a lot of control, and plus they had a lot of competition with German companies. Now, after World War I, German companies aren't making Mausers anymore. So pretty much you have the two big players. You have FN in Belgium, and then you have CZ. Now, the CZ and FN were sort of the big competitors at the time. Now everyone is just kind of recovering right after the war, but eventually FN comes out with their model of 1922 Mauser. This is kind of like their first real modern Mauser at the time. The FN-22 long rifle and carbine, they were kind of flops. Nobody really bought them. The main place that you'll find 1922s is with their carbines in Brazilian service. Brazil bought a kind of small number of these FN-22 carbines. So if you find FN 1922s, they're probably going to be the Brazilian guns. So in the early 20s, FN was approached by representatives from the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which became Yugoslavia in 1929. Now, this meeting turned out to be a godsend for FN because they had a really close relationship with what will become Yugoslavia. They actually developed together the FN 1922 pistol from the 1910. Also, they took a liking in the FN model of 1922, but they wanted some changes to it. So the Kingdom at the time was actually interested in CZ 9822 rifles. I did a video on one of those before, so if you're curious what they are, I'll put a little thingy up here. So they were interested in those guns, and the 9822s are based pretty much almost exactly on the German Gewehr 98 rifles. What happened is the Kingdom pretty much got with FN, and they kind of blended elements of the German G98 kind of with their model of 1922 carbine. What came out of it is known as the FN model of 1924. Now on the list of the things that the Kingdom wanted from FN on the new 1924 rifle was they wanted a short rifle, so no more of this long rifle and carbine thing. They wanted just a universal short rifle. They wanted a semi-pistol grip, which FN actually didn't have on guns previously. I think in Europe they referred to semi-pistol grip stocks as like the German style stock, something like that. They also wanted trigger guard locking screws. They wanted sight graduations on the top and the bottom of the sight. This is so a soldier, you kind of see this on early K98Ks. That's so if a soldier has a rifle, maybe they're laying down in cover, instead of having to peek up over the rifle, they can flip the sight forward and adjust the sight just looking at the bottom of it. The Kingdom also wanted the rifle chambered in 8mm Mauser. I could suspect that some Serbs were on the receiving side of 8mm Mauser during the war. So they were definitely impressed by the round, and that's the caliber that they chose for the gun. And they wanted to change the bands on the 1922 to kind of the German style with the H front band and the sort of standard mid band for the sling swivel. So this became the FN model of 1924. This is not to be confused with the VZ24. They're very similar guns, and they look very much alike. The untrained eye, you'd probably think they're exactly the same. So in 1925, the Kingdom ordered 100,000 of these 1924 Mauser rifles. More importantly, they ordered the machinery and the sort of the technical package and the assistance in making their own rifles. They set up their own factory. So most of the time when you find these Serbian 1924 rifles, They're going to be actually the ones that were made in their own country, not the FN ones, because they produced a lot more on their own than FN did. You can see a lot of times when a lot of countries were buying the Mausers, they kind of asked for packages of their own because, you know, domestic arms production is kind of important for countries to not rely on a foreign source. Kind of World War I was a really big lesson on that for a lot of countries. So other than the kingdom, Mexico and China were pretty good buyers of the 1924. Also, Iran bought 1924 Mausers. It's kind of confusing because Iran was called Persia back then, and even now if you search for it, a lot of collectors refer to them as Persian Mausers instead of Iranian Mausers. But Persia looked into the 1924. They ordered 500 from FN. And they ended up going with CZ-24s. They ended up going with the VZ-24 instead. Now, a lot of people think there's no actual evidence of it, unfortunately. Now, a lot of people think that it was FN losing this contract with Iran for Mausers that kind of spurred FN to produce the 1930. So a big thing to know with the FN 1924 rifle is that they went with a proprietary intermediate length receiver. It pretty much just means that bolts from German and Polish and, you know, other sort of standard length receiver Mausers won't fit in the FN 1924 Mausers, which you could see that as being a pretty big problem if there's a lot of surplus, a lot of German surplus and everything on the market. Countries with the standard length receivers aren't going to really want to buy this new intermediate receiver length, however better it might be. They want to stick with the standard length just for parts compatibility. FN recognized that, and then they released their model of 1930. I believe it went up for sale in 1930, and this is pretty much the 1924 with a standard length receiver and a couple small changes. So on the 1930, FN shortened the handguard. Originally, this top handguard went all the way to the front bands. They shortened that where it goes, you know, just past this rear barrel band here. They also made a couple small changes to the receiver shape and dimensions. It's kind of too small to see with the naked eye, but pretty much the main things is with the 1930, you have a standard length receiver. These bolts are compatible with German bolts, and the shortening of the handguard. This is probably the biggest giveaway if you're kind of looking and wondering if it's a 1924 or a 1930. This is why the Yugo M48 has that intermediate length receiver. It's a holdover of that older, you know, Serbian Yugoslavian 1924 FN Mauser. Now, a lot of people incorrectly refer to these as model 2430s, like 24/30. There is no model 2430. There is only the model 1924 and the model 1930. Anthony van der Linden thinks that that's a holdover from an FN catalog where they were just listing their modern rifles, and they just sort of put it as 24/30, just saying that they have both models. But there's no other real historical evidence that these were ever 2430s. So if you're referring to a Venezuelan Mauser model of 1930, it's just a model of 1930. So surprisingly, Venezuela has really massive oil reserves in their country, and in the 20s and 30s they experienced an oil boom which really filled their treasury, which meant that the military had a really large purchasing budget. And Venezuela's kind of always had a disproportionately large military for the country's size. And in the 30s, generals had kind of their own authority to purchase arms if they wanted to. They didn't have to really go through any sort of central authority or get permission. Generals could just decide for themselves that they wanted to buy arms, and that's pretty much what they did. It was a perfect storm for FN because FN was constantly sending people over to Venezuela and seeing if they wanted, you know, pistols or rifles or, you know, any of the newest whiz-bangs out there. So Venezuela placed an order for the model 1930 sometime in the mid-1930s. They think about 30,000 of them shipped over to Venezuela before World War II because, as we know, in 1940, the Germans overrun the FN Mauser plant and production of these rifles was shut down, which meant no new Mausers for Venezuela until after World War II. It took a couple years for FN to recover from the war, and in 1948, Venezuela ordered another 10,000 of these 1930 Mausers from FN. They also ordered FN-49 rifles, so it's kind of interesting that they ordered bolt actions and semi-autos at the same time. Also in 1954, they adopted the FN FAL rifle from FN, So FN kind of kept pretty close ties with Venezuela for a little over a decade. So what all that means is when Venezuela ordered these rifles, oftentimes they would order a lot more than they needed, and the rifles would pretty much just go into storage. The same thing happened with their FN-49 rifles. They ordered too many. A lot of those went into storage. It's kind of why whenever you find Venezuelan Mausers for sale today, they're either, immaculate, kind of like this one, or they're real rough. Because if they were issued, they probably went out and served in tropical-like conditions and got the normal just wear and tear that you find on a lot of Mausers. But because of the surplus that they ordered, we have a lot today in the U.S. marketplace that are just immaculate. This gun is pretty much just like it came out of the FN factory. It is what you might call time capsule perfect. And this is a really big treat for Mausers because a lot of the Mausers on the market today are really worn and really rough. So it's nice that, it's the possibility of getting a pretty pristine Mauser like this. Now, Venezuela surplus their Mausers and FN-49s in the 60s and 70s. Obviously, a lot of these came to the United States, but they did actually keep quite a few. And on their bicentennial parade in 2011, you could actually see these FN model of 1930s on parade in Venezuela, which is just always a neat thing to see, old Mausers and, in like modern military parades. I always enjoy that sort of thing. Not only did Venezuela order short rifles, they also ordered an unknown number of carbines. So here's an example of a Venezuelan carbine. They kind of come in all different variations. Not a lot is known on the Venezuelan FN contracts. So you can pretty much find these in a various number of configurations. This one it's just underslung. It just has the sling points underneath. Some you can find with sling attachment points on the side. Some also have little saddle ring attachments. You kind of find these in all sorts of different configurations. So it's kind of a neat gun to collect. I wish more information was known on these guns. Now I can say just from handling this thing, this is probably one of my favorite Mauser carbines in general. Being in 7mm, I think it's a lot more controllable than like a 7.65 or 8mm would be. It's got a turn down bolt handle, which is really nice. Just overall, this is just a really good feeling rifle. So not a lot of documentation survived on the Venezuelan contract, so most of what the collecting market knows about Venezuelan contracts is just kind of from observation. It can kind of be difficult in narrowing down precisely if a rifle is pre-war and post-war, because obviously there can be mixing of parts. A lot of times it just comes down to little tiny proof marks on the gun. What markings that are on and are not on the guns is sometimes a mystery as well. Anthony van der Linden in his FN Mauser Rifles book here does a pretty good job at just giving forth the information that is known about Venezuelan Mausers. There's not a whole lot of information out there, so if you want to learn more, this is kind of your only source for it. Anthony he's kind of like the FN guy, so he knows all about the pistols and rifles and everything. So if you're curious about any of that stuff, I'd highly recommend checking out his books, or this book in particular. It's the authors that do a lot of heavy lifting on this research and on this knowledge that we take for granted today. So I'd highly recommend picking up a copy of his book. Now let's do some close-ups. So here we have 3 Venezuelan Mausers laid out. The one in the middle here, this is the carbine. The one on either side, these are short rifles. Now probably the first thing you notice about these is the fact that the short rifles, they're still in the white, whereas the carbine receiver here has been blued. This is something that the Venezuelans did later on. They just sort of arsenal blued these. I'm guessing that this, the steel composition didn't hold up very well to the, to the tropical conditions that the rifle served in. The thought process, the reason why these came from FN factory in the white was the fact that now the steels that these are made of is fairly rust resistant, especially when you have a soldier sort of looking after and taking care of this rifle daily, and cleaning the gun daily. It doesn't really matter that much. Also, if the receivers are left in the white, you don't have to worry about a soldier hurting the finish when they're scrubbing the gun. So this was sort of looked at like a soldier proofing sort of thing. But obviously it warranted bluing later on, so maybe the steel composition wasn't maybe the best for anti-rust. Now I highlighted the receiver on this. This did not come highlighted. I did a video on this. If you want to see it, I'll put a card up here at the top of the screen. But this just would have been, regular blued. I just highlighted this so that you could see it better on camera. So when FN made the Venezuelan Mausers, one of the interesting things that they did was they had several slightly different type of roll dies for the Venezuelan Crests. So there's several variations of these Crests that are all just a little bit different. The differences are there so that workers could track like each sort of roll die and the wear on each roll die. That way they could narrow it down to that die. So what that means is that we have several different types of these Venezuelan Mauser Crests. If you can make out the text on the crest right here, that's kind of how you know you have one of the nicer, one of the more detailed crest designs. This Mauser here is slightly different. And if you look closely enough at the crest here, you'll notice that you can just barely not make out the text on the crest. It's just sort of barely illegible. Also, the horse doesn't have an eye in this crest. So there's several different variations. This is kind of just one of the more less detailed. And again, here's another variation of the crest. So these are all just slightly different. You'd have to really look hard at these to be able to know the difference. But there are several different crest types on these. It's just one of the neat things that makes collecting these really nice. And I mean, the Venezuelan crest on these Mausers is probably one of the best crests. It's probably my favorite crest on any Mauser. It is just a really beautiful design. So one of the hallmarks of these FN carbines is probably this short little stubby cleaning rod. Yes, this is the correct length. I mean, it's just real short and stubby. It looks kind of funny. Also notice how close together the barrel bands are. This band on this side clips into the front H-band there, whereas on the other side, this band pushes up against that. So it's just really kind of an interesting layout that both sides of the stock have a band. It just kind of gives the rifle a cute appearance. I don't know another good way of putting it. Also note this is the factory FN muzzle cover and sight protector that would go on these guns. It just has a little spring-loaded plunger inside, so you just press this on and rotate it. So here we have the rear side of the short rifle. You can see it goes from 200 to 2,000 meters. And then if you flip this forward, it also has the same markings underneath. So you could just move the sight to wherever, flip it forward, and your sight's there ready. This overall design is pretty similar to a K98K. If you're wondering what the screw is, the screw helps retain the top handguard. You want to remove this screw first and remove these very carefully. The top handguard attachment method is probably one of the weakest spots of the FN 24 and 30 Mauser rifles, so be careful whenever you're taking the top handguard off. And here's the rear side of the carbine. Of course, this is much shorter. We just go from 200 to 1400. Unlike the short rifle, this sight doesn't flip all the way forward. Of course, there's no markings underneath. Same screw, top handguard disassembly method. Just be careful with these again. So Venezuelan Mausers, they only have really 3 numbers on them. Of course, you have the serial number on the side of the receiver here. This is a little bit different being on the right side. It seems like most are kind of on the other side. And then you also have the matching serial number on the stock. This is just a quick, easy way to make sure you have the right stock on your gun. I would also say if you're looking at getting one of these, make sure that these numbers are still stamped deep and sharp. This is kind of a dead giveaway if the stock has been sanded. These numbers will be much lighter. So these are the 2 numbers as well as the number on the bolt handle here. So these are the 3 numbers to look out for. Probably the bolts are the most commonly misnumbered. Now the only way I have to know if you guys like this sort of content is from you liking and commenting on the video. So please try to do that. I read all the comments. It helps out the YouTube algorithm. It helps out my channel. So I really appreciate that. I also appreciate you guys watching. I'm not just saying that. I really do appreciate you guys. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.